Hello, everybody. It is Professor Parish, and we are on Module 4. So I'm recording this on Saturday. So as I'm recording this, if you've not completed Module 3, I've graded a little bit the ones that have done work ahead of time, but you've got a lot due this weekend by Sunday for Module 3. So just make sure that you get your first paper turned in, that you have these other assignments completed. This weekend's kind of a crazy weekend because you've got a lot of assignments due. So just make sure, the big thing is, make sure you get that paper turned in because that's 100 points. So even if it's not completed, go ahead and submit that paper because that way you at least get the chance to revise. If you don't turn anything in by Sunday night, you don't get the chance to revise. And I don't take anything past that 11:59 date, so just make sure that you get it turned in on time. But we're going to talk about Module 4. So Module 4, we're starting out poetry. We kind of started out last week with some different assignments that were dealing with poetry. But I want to go over, and we'll go back to Module 3 to look at the paper guidelines here in a second. But for Module 4, there are a lot of little readings. It looks like a lot on here, but when you actually look at the pages in the book, they're only like 1 or 2 pages each. So there's actually not a lot of reading, just lots of different sections. So there's a section on song that starts on page 804. There's a section on sound, on rhythm, how poetry, sounds and how it forms like a beat and a melody kind of. There's a difference between open form and closed form, which are talked about in our book. Obviously, symbolism we talked about with short story, but it kind of extends on into poetry. Poetry relies heavily on symbolism and imagery. So there's a section on that. And then there's even mythology and about poetry and personal identity, because a lot of poets, they use poetry as a way to kind of define their identity, explore their agency, explore different things about themselves and emotionality that oftentimes you don't get to do in fiction or drama because those are about the characters, whereas poetry can be about the poet themselves or can be about a specific emotion. Poetry has a lot more options to it, which is really nice. And so I've kind of put those different little short segments from our textbook here in the readings, just so you can get an idea. Because as you're working on paper 2, you're going to have to either explain the poems that you're analyzing, or you're going to have to explain your own poetry. And so these sections will all give you terminology and different things that you can talk about in your papers and kind of identify how you structure a poem, how you create it, and it's going to give you a chance to kind of explore that. And so that's kind of the reason I've assigned these writings. So I'm going to backtrack a little though. Before we talk about the assignments, I want to talk about paper number 2. So I'm going to go back to Module 3 and go to the paper 2 guidelines. So honestly, if I'm being honest with y'all, this paper is probably the hardest in the class. And it's not hard because it's long. It's still only 3 full pages. But here's the thing. You have a couple options, and I want to be clear about how formatting goes with this second paper. So your paper overall has to be 3 full pages, all right? Has to be 3 full pages. I think a lot of people get confused upon that, but it has to be 3 full pages like the last paper. It can be longer than that, absolutely, but it has to at minimum be 3 full pages. So you have 2 options. You can either create 2 poems of your own, and then you're going to compare and contrast them using terminology from our textbook's chapters on poetry. By 2 poems, I mean they need to be full poems. They don't need to just, if you do a haiku, you can do a haiku, but there better be a lot of analysis on those haiku, okay? But 2 full poems, and then you compare and contrast them and talk about them using terminology from our textbook. To explain, it's kind of like you're analyzing your own decisions as a writer. Why did I choose this? Why did I choose that? What was my impetus for creating these poems? What was the reasoning? If you don't want to be creative and make your own poems, that's fine. You can compare and contrast 2 or more poems from our textbook. You can do that too. So you've got those 2 options, right? You can either create 2 poems to compare and contrast, or you can pick 2 out of our book. Either one. So it has to be at least 3 full pages, including the poems. So 1-inch margins, double spaced. I know it doesn't say double spaced on here, but a college paper should be double spaced. And then 12-point legible font. The analysis, not including the poems, should be over 2 pages. And that's only for option 1. If you chose option 2, it's 3 full pages of analysis, to be clear. But if you picked option 2 and you constructed a whole page of poetry, like your 2 poems took up an entire page, then I'm okay with your analysis being 2 full pages instead of 3. If you chose option 1. If you choose option 2, it's got to be 3 full pages no matter what. But if you chose option 1, you are using an entire page to craft your poems. So I'm okay with it being 2 full pages of analysis after that. Now, if you choose haikus are only 3 lines each. There's not a lot of, you're not going to fill a full page with 2 haikus. So then, yeah, you've got to have at least 3 full pages of analysis. All right. And I'll talk to you about that on your draft if you submit it. And if you submit your draft and these requirements aren't met, then I'm going to talk about that for the revision. All right. They should be in essay format, should have an introduction and conclusion. People that choose option 1 usually do their 2 poems on the first page, and then they start their analysis with the introduction and conclusion. You can kind of work it however you want to. If you choose option 2, don't write out the poems. Don't write out the poems and assume that's going to be part of the 3 pages. I've had students do that. Instead, you can just tell me what the poems are, like the titles, and I can look up the poems in our textbook, and that won't be a big deal. You do need to cite your textbook in MLA. MLA is a requirement for this paper. You do have to cite your textbook because you're using terminology from it to talk about the poems, even if you wrote your own poems. So you do need to cite your textbook in MLA, use in-text citations, and then if you have any outside sources, then you need to cite them as well. And so we're going to start getting into MLA and making sure that you can cite, which if you took English 121 at SIC, you should already be somewhat familiar with MLA, so this should just be more practice. But I want to kind of see where we're at in terms of MLA. As far as due dates go, the thesis statement and outline is due this weekend, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Your draft's going to be due November 14th, so a quick turnaround, and then around Thanksgiving weekend is when the revisions will be due. So you've got a little bit of time on that. But then the way that it's graded is kind of listed down here as well. So going back to Module 4 then, we'll talk about the assignments. So the thesis and outline is an assignment that's due this Sunday. So really, your thesis, you should tell me which option you picked. Did you choose to write your own poems, or did you choose to analyze 2 out of the textbook? And if you chose to analyze 2 out of the textbook, I do want to know which 2 you're thinking about. Even if you change your mind later, give me 2 that you think would work. And then as far as your outline goes, it's just a skeletal framework saying, here's my introduction, I'm going to talk about imagery, or I'm going to talk about symbolism. Here's my 2 poems. Here's how I'm going to talk about each of them, or talk about them together and compare and contrast them. I just want to have some idea that you're using terminology from the textbook and you kind of have an idea of what you're going to talk about. Because again, you have a fast turnaround with this paper, so you should be thinking about that. And if you say you're going to talk about imagery and symbolism, and then when you get to actually writing the paper, you change your mind and you're like, I think I'm going to do imagery and tone. That's fine. You can change it later. I just want to know that you have a framework and you have a starting point, and you're not just on November 13th writing the paper for the first time. So with no idea of where you're going with it. So it's just to give a framework of what you're going to do. So that thesis and outline is going to be due Sunday, the 7th. The other 2 assignments, your reading response, it's similar to the last one. You're choosing poems from our textbook. These poems should be from chapters 21 through 28. And then you're going to answer these questions, like what were the 4 poems you chose and why, which term applies best for each poem and why, which poem's your favorite, which poem did you like the least and why. Pretty straightforward, just to see that we are able to look at poetry and analyze, and hopefully the poems that you look at, the terminology, when you see which terms match those poems, that'll help you in writing your paper. Just be like, okay, well, this term applied to this poem really well, and the poem I picked for my paper is kind of similar to it, so I could use that to talk about it too. So it's just trying to it's trying to give you practice analyzing and writing things out so that you can kind of get warmed up when you write your actual paper. And then the discussion forum this week, we did last week look at poetry that we were listening to and comparing that to how spoken poetry differs from just reading a poem. We're going to take it a step further this week. So this week we're going to look at slam poetry. If you've never heard of slam poetry, it's very performative. So in the last week's discussion forum, the poems y'all looked at were just poems that people were just reading off the page, right? Slam poetry has an audience in mind, and it often wants audience participation. So if you've ever watched a movie where there's been a poetry slam, people are like snapping their fingers and being like, yeah, like all this, that's a slam poetry. It demands audience participation. It wants to get an audience worked up and watching alongside it. So I've got this site, Digital Poet. I'm going to show you all the website. So there's several categories to choose from. There's and I will say this, I've noted this in the discussion forum, some of these poems deal with very mature subject matter. So like you can see here, there's poems about drug use, social issues and problems. There's poems about love, emotional poems. If you don't want to get something so risque, and if you don't want to do something that heavy, then you can go down to like upbeat poems. You can choose from there. You can choose funny or silly poems, things like that. So you don't have to choose a dark poem if you don't want to. So for example, the upbeat poems, if I click on this, you'll see that there is, like I said, there is some mature, serious subject matter. So you don't have to choose the poems if you don't want to. You could choose one that's like called, we're going to do cricket calls. So yeah, you'll see the poem actually listed here and you can read it. And then you'll see that there's a thing where you can actually hear it. But again, these poems, some of them are about more serious subject matter. So if I go down to silly poems, yeah. Like this chocolate one. You can see it kind of detailed here. All right. But yeah. So ideally pick one that has where you can listen to it as well. That would be good. Story poems, like if I do here, I could do this one. And then there's a poet there. Some of them don't have where you can listen to it as well, which is kind of sad, but try to find one that has, like, if it has this little sound clip here, try to find a poem that has a sound clip. That way you can listen to it as well as read it too. All right. But like I said, some of the poems in the discussion forum, they have mature themes, they have language use. So if that's not your deal, if you don't like poems like that, which I totally understand, then just choose a poem that doesn't have any like foul language or heavy themes, and that's okay. But after you've picked and listened to your poem, I do want you to answer the following questions. Which category did you pick from and why? Which poem did you pick? How did you envision the audience participating when this poem is read out loud? That is to say, how do you imagine the audience is going to react to this poem? Some poets choose to be vulgar or have mature themes because they want to elicit an emotional response from their audience. So why do you think the poet chose to do this? And then based on last week's discussion, do you notice a difference in slam poetry versus a poem that's just read aloud? What is the difference? And you can kind of explain your answer there. But I really like this discussion forum. I think that this discussion forum and the last one gets our class to really talk about what they like and don't like about certain poems. And I feel like everybody choosing different options or choosing similar options makes for a really good discussion. So I'm excited to see what y'all choose for that. But yeah, that is module 4 for the week. If you all have any questions, please let me know. Module 5 will be open too, but you don't have to work ahead unless you really want to. But just don't turn in your paper number 2 until I see your thesis and outline. I've had some students do that where they do the thesis and outline and they just instantly turn in the paper after that. And I'm like, just wait until I give you some feedback just to be sure, because otherwise you have to resubmit and it can be problematic. So in any case, I hope you all have a happy Halloween weekend. Please stay safe. Take care. And yeah, next week I'll be back to talk about module 5. We're at the halfway point, so if y'all have any questions, just let me know. But otherwise, I'll see y'all next week. Bye.